Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. I'm actually going to share my screen and walk through a presentation, and we can then have a discussion from there. Okay, I wanted to introduce myself first. I am the president and CEO of Chart Industries, and at Chart, we are cryogenic designers and manufacturers of process technology and equipment for the end markets of clean energy as well as industrial gases. And so this hits a broad set of molecules as well as applications that are really important in many of the clean power, clean water, clean food, and clean industrial applications that you're hearing more and more about around the sustainability and climate targets that are out there, both in the public and private sectors. We sit in a very unique position in the value chain of the molecule. So we sit in the middle where we provide process technology and equipment to the producers of the molecule as well as to the end users of the molecule. And what's important about that is we are molecule agnostic. So we look at this as a hybrid of opportunities in the clean energy transition. And as the result of that, we can see the variety of different types of power and fuel solutions that exist out there. So I've structured my comments today a little bit about the traditional markets as well as the energy transition, because the combination thereof is really important when you think about how this gets funded, as well as how investments occur in these newer and upcoming spaces that are critical to invest in today in order to achieve the targets that are out there for 2030 as well as 2050. So quickly, to set the stage, for those of you less familiar with Chart, we're a really unique company, and we do a variety of different fun things, I would say. We have about 4,600 employees around the world, and about 50% of those are located in our India, China, and EU locations that you can see here. I expect that will continue to unfold as the clean energy transition unfolds, in particular because there's varying degrees of funding, there's varying degrees of support in the current state for the different renewables that are growing and growing between now and 2040. This is a set of pictures of the different types of equipment, and it's very important that we think about this around the fact that you need infrastructure in order to achieve any of the targets that are out there. So I show these pictures to show the variety of need of infrastructure, and I'll go into some descriptions of these, but all of these are really utilized in the combination of how clean works together. So clean being sustainability, being around ESG, and this isn't just around clean power, it is the combination of water and power and industrials. And that's something that's very important when you think about how the next decade is going to unfold, in particular around renewables. And I show this because it really is, how do you create the opportunities for the variety of different applications to work together in what surely will be that hybrid of solutions. It's also important in the discussion when we're talking about how to fund, that we talk about the industry groups that participate in the energy transition and how you participate in industry groups such as Hydrogen Council, such as the India Hydrogen Alliance, in order for the industry to build upon itself and to find those various different ways of funding, whether that's green funds or other ways to get the money to kickstart the economy that is still very nascent. So as we talk about hydrogen, this is the value chain that I briefly spoke of at the beginning, and you can see that there's a variety of different pieces and parts in this. Perhaps the most important part of the discussion is, how do we get into the projects and get them moving, and what are the right projects for hydrogen, so that we can have this be a cost competitive part of the solution, as well as have it be scalable. And that's what you see really in the natural gas economy. That's what you also see in diesel. So we're talking about having the funding and having the investment in order to drive cost competitive and scalability for the hydrogen molecule when you compare it to other answers for power and fuel. So how do we achieve that? And first, let's step back to the macro picture of what's happening in the hydrogen economy. So first of all, hydrogen is hot, and I say that somewhat jokingly because it's actually one of the coldest molecules at negative 423 degrees in the market. But we've been manufacturing hydrogen equipment for over 56 years, and it really wasn't until the last couple of years where it became a topic that was very real and tangible in the market as part of the drive for the solution to clean. So you can see on the left-hand side that there's over $500 billion of investment in projects that have been announced in the last 12 months. 150 billion of that 500 billion investment has been announced since February of this year. So the increase in funding, the increase in availability of capital to do these projects is a key part of the change that's been happening in the hydrogen industry. I mean, historically, hydrogen was really used in the space applications, space exploration, whether that was the Indian Space Research Organization or NASA in the United States. And now you're seeing it being utilized across a variety of different applications that I showed on my last slide. So there's also a perfect storm of activity. And again, whether that's public or private sector, that's happening right now. If you look at the various governments around the world, you see 31 different countries that have national hydrogen strategies. Of those 31, more than half have announced those hydrogen strategies in 2021 alone. You also look at the investment around where is that investment occurring? And that's what you really see on those three bubbles on the screen here is production, distribution, and end application. So that was those same three buckets that I showed on the value chain. A lot of the investment right now and where a lot of the cost of the molecule is in production. So you really need access to create that molecule itself, and you need to drive that cost down. And that's how investment in larger scale projects is going to be a key and critical part of the first half of this decade in order to have hydrogen be cost competitive when comparing to diesel or when comparing to natural gas. So from our seat in the middle of that value chain and here in the now, what we're seeing in terms of equipment sales is around the process or the production on the left-hand side of the circles there, as well as fueling transport. And that's to bring the infrastructure to the end users. One of the reasons for my comment about the hybrid of renewables over the course of time is that there is existing oil and gas infrastructure and coal infrastructure around the world. Infrastructure that at the end of the day is not in its entirety going to be ripped out. So rather, how do we utilize existing infrastructure or make it capable to handle different types of molecules, inclusive of hydrogen? So for example, in many cases, the natural gas infrastructure is still being implemented around the world because it is cost competitive and it is scalable. And that's a good thing because it solves an immediate need. But there's a way to make natural gas infrastructure usable for hydrogen too. And fundamentally, all of this requires the funding that we're talking about today and money to make this happen. So the funding is simply a matter of time, in my opinion. What I mean by that is it is going to happen. It's either going to happen now or it's going to happen in the future. So if you do it now, you're not going to end up playing the catch-up game that we've seen with other molecules, inclusive of natural gas. So being proactive and taking advantage of the solutions to solve for this is really critical in the first couple of years of the 2020 decade. There's a variety of options available for funding, although I would argue that these options need to be more universally available and faster versus regionally available, which is what we're seeing today. These options for funding include, and certainly aren't limited to, green funds, hydrogen-specific funds like FiveT, which support projects by investing in them for specifically defined terms and specifically defined periods of time. Private sector investment like Chart does as a company, the government or public stimulus money, also government or public tax credit or tax hurts. And those types of credit programs can be in the form of tax or can be in the form of finding ways to create different types of carbon credit systems. So these funding opportunities are really not strictly related to hydrogen. You heard in the opening remarks that we've got battery solutions, you got solar solutions, but at the end of the day, there is going to be a hybrid, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen here. And that's really bringing together the combination of renewables that make the most sense for each applications. This slide demonstrates that we're really seeing the renewables being the largest piece of the growth puzzle over the course of the next 20 years. And you see that on the right-hand side of the page. So if I look at the types of economies, the types of industries, and the types of countries that are investing and setting these targets for 2030 or 2050 or 2060, what you see on the screen here is countries that in 2020, June of 2020, so just about a year ago, we were talking about the number of countries having these targets could fit on one slide, could fit on the screen that you're seeing today. But governments now, if you updated this slide, it would take numerous pages. So that's been a significant change in the last 12 months. All of the governments that have committed to a greener and cleaner future have looked to each other on how they're rolling that out. And I talked about the types of funding. Now, 75 different countries have net zero carbon emission targets. One of the things that's important in order to achieve these is, again, as I talked about earlier, the industry groups. So there's various different private sector companies that are working together in alliances in order to make sure that the governments that are being supported have the information on how you go about this and how do you take that government stimulus and carbon credit program to spur investment and advantage hydrogen as an example, but also make sure that the industry itself finds ways to continue to operate over the course of time without being dependent on the public sector funding. And so that self-sustainability of the industry is an important factor in how the hydrogen economy unfolds going forward. So utilizing the public sector funding should be thought of as an industry as a temporary help to kickstart the investment. And then how do you go from there, again, to make this a self-sustaining event? What we're also finding around the world in government stimulus programs is that they can come in various different forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be money funding. It can be funding of specific projects. So these projects are meant to position each respective economy for hydrogen, regardless of the location, for that region to have a start when there becomes the connections between regions, similar to what we have seen with natural gas. So right now, a lot of the hydrogen work is being funded on a regional basis. At some point, there will be an interlinkage globally between the hydrogen economies. And it's important that activity happens today in order for each particular country in each particular region, in particular in India, that you're not left where you have to play catch up again in 10 years or in 15 years. So the interlinkage between the hydrogen economies and the regions is something to watch very carefully and something to make sure that investment is happening today so that when it becomes a global market, you have the ability to participate in that global market. So what are we seeing now in hydrogen? We're seeing liquefaction. So liquefaction, there's various different types of hydrogen, which is really important when you think of how do I invest in this and how do I pick the right solutions and the answers. And there's technical elements of hydrogen in particular that you have to understand in order to make the right decisions of where to invest and what funds to ask for. So liquefaction has been something that's important when thinking about where monies are going. Understanding the difference between gaseous and liquid hydrogen is important. And that, again, goes to, am I putting infrastructure in place that's going to be utilized and going to be cost competitive? If you look at a year ago, we were looking at 4 or 5 different types of liquefaction projects for hydrogen. Today, we're looking at over 30 different types of liquefaction projects. And that's really the result of liquid hydrogen being more volumetrically efficient than gaseous hydrogen, which allows you to have longer distances and heavy duty transportation. It also allows you to store the fuel. It's a denser fuel, so it allows you to store in smaller plot sizes if that is a concern. Liquid hydrogen is easier to transfer than gaseous hydrogen because it has less boil off than gaseous does. And you have a variety of different technical elements to be considered when you're investing or choosing how to ask for funding. And a key part of that is to articulate the value proposition around why you're investing in a 30 ton per day liquefaction project, or why are you investing in a series of hydrogen fueling stations in geography A or geography B. So these are critical to the discussion on how to get funds and how to go about asking for them. We're also seeing a lot on hydrogen tanks. So whether gaseous or liquid hydrogen, you need to have a place to store it. And that's both at that front end, the production site that you saw on the value chain, as well as at the end use site, whether that's a fueling station or whether that's a warehouse that is utilizing hydrogen for the molecule in whatever application is being used. Just a fun fact to share with you, we Chart have built India's largest liquid hydrogen tank for the ISRO. That was just done last year. So these are large tanks, and certainly having the capability and the safety elements around this is another part of thinking of how do I make sure that I'm getting the right funding and I'm getting the right quality associated with handling a very important and dense molecule. So now you have the hydrogen produced and stored, but it's not near the end user, like a fueling station or a manufacturing facility that needs it for fuel cells. How do you get it there? So again, via hydrogen transport or trailers like you see on the screen right now. If you're wondering if this is really something that's used more and more, the answer is yes. We're seeing numerous different versions of what you see on the screen today. And that is a key indicator that hydrogen projects are being funded. The more you see the transport of it means that there are more and more production sites of it. And that's important when you think about, again, how do you get these projects funded? So this slide talks a little bit more about integrated solutions, which directionally is where the hydrogen market is going, specifically more full offerings for fuel stations around the element, again, of infrastructure. So we're seeing a lot around, I have an existing fueling station for LCNG. How do I make that LCNG station handle hydrogen as well? And there's pieces and parts to that, but it's really important that you have the funding to be able to do that. And it goes back to my comment around if we're going to do it now or we're going to do it later, the investment is going to happen. So it's better to do it now than playing catch up. And I'd say the other piece of the puzzle to think about when you're talking about green funding is around certifications. So right now, certifications are very regional, but making sure that you're prepared for the concept of this being a global economy. And that's why, again, investment today is extremely important. So ultimately, how big will this be? You can see on this screen a variety of different partnerships, and I think that's really important over the course of time that the economy builds upon itself through the partnerships, and that is another way to think about funding, right? So the private sector idea of I'm going to do a demonstration project and I'm going to do it with 2 or 3 different partners that sit in that value chain. And that is a way to kickstart and demonstrate that the economy can work. And it's a way to create the cost-effective solution that's there. But at the end of the day, the private sector cannot simply fund the kickstarting of the economy. It has to have a combination of the 5 different types of funding that I talked about earlier. And to talk about the size of the market is really important. Hydrogen currently is less than 1% of the total global power or fueling economy. And we expect it to be 16 to 18% of the energy around the world by 2040. So that's a significant increase in terms of the amount of investment that is needed to get this moving. And you can see from simply our company's perspective that hydrogen is the #1 area that we expect the market to expand dramatically over the next 10 years. So I'm going to close with probably my favorite slide, because it's just a bunch of questions and things to think about when you're thinking about funding this particular portion of the renewables. And I put it together really to spur conversation because there's so many various viewpoints on these topics. I'm going to quickly touch on a few. It's important, again, on the public sector incentives and stimulus that policy supports it, and there's ways for the economy to have access to that capital. With policy support, the hydrogen economy could produce millions of jobs by 2030 and be multi-hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy in that same time frame. But ultimately, again, it has to be self-sustaining. Somebody has to pay these people that are going to be working these jobs. One of my favorite questions, I've kind of hinted to it is it's going to be a global economy instead of a regional economy. And that's really important when you think about what's the pricing model. Is this going to have a spot market like natural gas? There's plenty of hydrogen specific funds that are already out there, in particular in the EU, that have benchmark pricing, that are ways that you can play, but not be fully exposed to one single hydrogen investment or project. And lastly, collaborating and partnering. You saw this on the prior slide over here, that these partnerships are really important to build the economy and have it be ready to play in that same time frame in this decade. You have to think though carefully about who you partner with, because there's long-standing relationships that will result from that. And how does that work in terms of where you want your company or where you want your investment to be? So I'd be remiss in not commenting on our number one priority in hydrogen and all other molecules, which is safety. So safety is a really important consideration, in particular for investors to think about. So these are not projects that you should be doing with some company that is just new into hydrogen. It has to be thought about as experience, as quality, and how do I play to make sure that this is very safe? Because the worst thing that can happen for a nascent economy that's just getting started, or industry that's just starting to evolve, is to have a safety incident. So I'd say place your bets, and it'll be a really fun conversation during the Q&A session to hear the various different views about how hydrogen will play over the coming decades. Thank you for allowing me to have this time.